The Sunday School lesson for November 15th is Confront Sin. The main point of the lesson is call sin what it is and point to what God says about it. The focal passage is Daniel 5, verses 17 through 28. Though the legacy of Christianity is certainly in decline in our culture, the influence of Judeo-Christian ethics is still present and still in the majority. In the United States, Christians are not the outsiders, though we may feel that way sometimes. There are other places around the world where the righteous are certainly in a minority. Because they are outnumbered, they may feel intimidated in confronting sin. Daniel was also in the minority in a pagan culture. He could have kept quiet in order to have a more peaceful and easy life. However, in obedience to God, Daniel boldly challenged sin and proclaimed the righteousness demanded by God. Daniel had been carried into captivity by Nebuchadnezzar in 605 BC. He had been trained to serve in the empire and became a trusted advisor to the king. Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BC. The events of chapter 5 occurred roughly in 539 BC. More than 23 years had passed between the events of chapter 4 and the start of chapter 5. Those had been eventful years for Babylon. When Nebuchadnezzar died, his kingdom fell into the hands of his son. But his son did not last long and was assassinated about 2 years into his reign. His assassin, who was also his brother-in-law, assumed the throne, but he did not last long either. After 4 years, he died and was replaced by his young son. Some thought that son was too young to rule, so they killed him. The man who assumed the throne at that point was named Nabonidus. There is not a lot known about Nabonidus' background. He was not a direct descendant of Nebuchadnezzar. Some speculate that he married into the family, but if he did, he remained the black sheep of the family. He worshipped a different god than Nebuchadnezzar and the rest of Babylon. For that reason, he moved west to Arabia to live at an oasis shrine. I found it interesting that Nabonidus is considered to be the first archaeologist, as he had an interest in the past and actually led excavations of ancient sites. Because of his difference in religion and his interesting hobbies, Nabonidus left the kingdom in the hands of his son Belshazzar, which was probably not a wise move. He would later return on the scene to find the Persians and Medes marching into Babylon. He tried to fight them off, but failed. It's not clear at that point what happened to Nabonidus. We know more about Belshazzar, though. Belshazzar began a co-regency with his father in 550 BC. Even though he shared the reign with his father, he was the one in charge and running things. He did not do a great job. He called for a mighty banquet even though his city was about to be under siege by the Medes and Persians. Daniel tells us in Daniel 5 verses 1 and 2, Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the 1,000. Belshazzar, while he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives and his concubines might drink therein. Extravagant banquets were common among ancient kings. They used the banquets to show off their wealth and accomplishments. It was also a means of securing loyalty from the various nobles and leaders in the kingdom. In the midst of the banquet, because of his drunkenness, Belshazzar called for the vessels that had been removed from the temple in Jerusalem. The phrase, while he tasted the wine, that doesn't mean while he was sipping at it. That means it was kicking in. He was getting drunk. It also refers to Nebuchadnezzar as his father. The Hebrew word there can be translated as father. It can also mean ancestor or predecessor. So he is not the son, the direct son of Nebuchadnezzar, but he is his successor. And that word in Hebrew can mean a variety of those things. And it will constantly refer to him as Nebuchadnezzar's son or Nebuchadnezzar as his father, simply to stress the connection as a king and his successor. Nebuchadnezzar had taken the vessels, holy vessels that were set aside for use in the temple when he conquered Jerusalem. But he had set those aside basically into his treasury, and they remained sacred and protected and not used by common hands. There would have been a great respect, even though in Nebuchadnezzar's mind his gods had conquered the God of Jerusalem. He still would have had some respect. Ancient peoples had respect for sacred objects. They didn't often destroy them. And so they would have had some veneration for them, some respect, because it's not that they believed that their gods were the only gods. They simply believed their gods were better than the other gods. But they believed in the other gods as well. They were polytheists, meaning many gods. And oftentimes they believed that each land had its god. So they would be very careful about showing respect. Belshazzar remembered those vessels, even though he didn't apparently remember much else about Nebuchadnezzar's life, or at least the lessons that Nebuchadnezzar had learned. He called for the vessels in order to boast. He was boasting in someone else's accomplishments. The real problem, though, was that he was committing a blasphemous act. Again, in the ancient world, there was supposed to be a respect and a reverence for sacred items. Even if they belonged to a god you didn't worship, you would generally show respect for things set aside for deities. You had to be careful in dealing with divine things. But drunken Belshazzar committed a grievous error and breach of protocol as far as the ancient world was concerned. What made matters worse is that these vessels had been dedicated to the worship of the one true God in Jerusalem's temple. These vessels belonged to God, and to treat them as common drinking cups was a grave insult to God. Instead of humbling himself before God, Belshazzar was insulting God. In the midst of the banquet, an amazing message was delivered. Daniel 5:5. In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. When I read this passage, I think of the TV show The Addams Family with Thing. If you don't remember, in the Addams Family there were boxes and little compartments throughout the house, and whenever they needed him, Thing would kind of just pop up to lend a hand. And that's all he was a hand. However, this time in Daniel, it was very real. There was a disembodied hand that appeared. Daniel gives a very detailed description of the event. This was not random graffiti that was discovered, but an actual disembodied hand writing on the wall, and everybody saw it. He gives the location of the writing. It was in plain sight in a well-lit area of the king's banquet hall. And even though the king was drunk, he could clearly see this hand writing by itself, and others did as well. The sight, well, in modern parlance, the sight freaked out the king and left his knees knocking. He sobered up quickly and called for all the wise men to explain what the omen meant. He offered a large reward to whoever could explain the supernatural event, but none of the wise men were able to offer an explanation. That scared the king even more. At that point, the queen entered. She was probably the queen mother, the wife of Nabonidus, and the mother of Belshazzar. Some also suppose that she was the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. She remembered about the dreams that troubled Nebuchadnezzar, and the only man that could interpret them. She suggested that Belshazzar summon Daniel to provide an explanation. Now, Daniel was an old man at this time and was no longer serving as an advisor. Daniel was brought before Belshazzar, and the king explained the situation. Now, he simultaneously belittled and buttered up Daniel. He identified Daniel as an outsider, a member of a conquered people. Kind of like, well, Nebuchadnezzar conquered your people and brought you here. You're lower than me, therefore you should serve me. But also, I've heard great things about you. And I've heard that you can do things, that you have better wisdom than everybody else. He had heard about Daniel's wisdom and insight, and how Daniel could solve problems that no one else could. And he promised a great reward to Daniel if he could explain the writing on the wall. Daniel 5:17. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, Let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing unto the king, and make known to him the interpretation. O thou king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him, whom he would slew, and whom he would kept alive, and whom he would set up, and whom he would put down. But when his heart was lifted up, and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne. And they took his glory from him, and he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild asses. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointeth over it whomever he will. Daniel had no need for the reward that the king offered. He was willing to share the truth of God for free. Plus, Daniel also realized that the king's rewards were worthless. Now, there's an important thing in that. Daniel says, I'll tell you for free. If you ever hear somebody who says, I can tell you the secrets of God for a price, don't believe them. Anybody who says, well, I can help you get closer to God for a price, save your money. Because those who are righteous will tell the truth of God for free. Daniel didn't need the king's gifts, and he also knew the king was doomed. Before he interpreted the writing, though, he gave Belshazzar a history lesson. God had given Nebuchadnezzar a great kingdom and tremendous power. He had given it to Nebuchadnezzar to accomplish God's purpose, and that was to bring punishment upon Judah to purify it and prepare the way for salvation. He had to deal with the sin in Judah that had grown rampant and was threatening the promise that God had given Israel. So God had to deal with that, and he used Nebuchadnezzar to do that. Now, Nebuchadnezzar thought he did it all on his own. And he had amassed a tremendous empire. He had built the greatest city in the world at that time. But at the peak of Nebuchadnezzar's power, he had grown in arrogance and pride. So God humbled the great king. Nebuchadnezzar lost his mind and became an animal for 7 years. The king was given an opportunity to honor God during this period of madness, and he realized the greatness of God. And after humbling himself before God, God restored Nebuchadnezzar to his throne. Nebuchadnezzar realized that God was the one that empowered kings and controls the destiny of kingdoms. Nebuchadnezzar learned and honored God. Daniel 5:22. And thou his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, thou that, though thou knewest all this, but hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven. And they have brought the vessels of his house before thee, and thou and thy lords, thy wives and thy concubines, have drunk wine in them, and thou hast praised the gods of silver and gold, of brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know, and the God in whose hands thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. Belshazzar knew nothing of humility. Daniel pointed out that Belshazzar knew the stories about Nebuchadnezzar and knew the decrees of Nebuchadnezzar regarding God. Records indicate that Belshazzar was an official, a high-ranking official in Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom during the time of the king's madness. Belshazzar disregarded those stories and grew in arrogance. Daniel noted that Belshazzar had committed grave sacrilege by using the sacred vessels from the temple as common tableware. He had intentionally challenged God, and God had responded. He had worshipped false idols, idols of man-made invention that could do nothing, while the true living God he had spurned and attacked. God had control over all life, but Belshazzar had failed to glorify him, had worshipped false idols, and had insulted God. Daniel then gave him the meaning of the inscription. Verse 24. Then was the power of the hand sent from him, and this writing was written. And this is the writing that was written. Mene, Mene, Tekel Upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom, and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances, and art found wanting. Peres, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. The hand had written 4 words on the wall. For the grammarians out there, the 4 words are Aramaic passive participles. Mene means numbered or counted. Tekel means weighed. A parsin means divided. Menad is doubled to demonstrate the certainty of the judgment. God had evaluated Belshazzar in his kingdom, and it failed to measure up. His kingdom would be taken from him and given to another empire. The Psalms tell us in Psalm 33:12, "Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, and the people whom he hath chosen for his own inheritance." But those nations that oppose God will be removed. God judges them, and when they're found wanting, God removes them. Daniel boldly confronted the sin of Belshazzar and foretold the judgment that would befall him. Immediately, Belshazzar repented and the judgment was averted. Nope, that didn't happen. Belshazzar didn't respond in any type of repentance or even concern. Instead, he was pleased that Daniel could interpret the writing. Again, not too bright at times. And he gave him a great reward. Everything that he had promised, he gave him clothes, he gave him treasure, and he made him third in line in the kingdom. He was the third most powerful person. Belshazzar was technically the second most powerful person. Nabonidus was still technically in charge, even though he ran things. Even though Belshazzar ran things. But it was all for naught. That very night, Daniel's prophecy came to pass. Daniel 5:30 says, "In that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain." Nebuchadnezzar had built a great city with immense defenses, multiple walls inside of other walls, huge walls. The Medes and Persians could not have easily breached those massive walls that Nebuchadnezzar built, so they didn't. Greek historians record that the Medo-Persian army diverted the Euphrates River that flowed under the walls of Babylon. The rivers flowed through the city, but they had to flow under the walls. Now, as long as the river was flowing at normal height, you couldn't get into the city because the water covered over a portion of the wall and passed under it. You couldn't swim under it. It was would have been too difficult for an army to swim under it, certainly. So what happened is the Medo-Persian army, the army of the Persians and Medians, diverted the river. They built a temporary canal and dam system to divert the river so that the water dropped under the wall. And then they simply marched in under the wall. And they attacked, the Greeks tell us, the Greek historians tell us that they attacked during a major festival when the Babylonians were drunk. So it lines up, secular history lines up exactly with the Bible's, what the Bible tells us here. And the Greek historians say the Babylonians were drunk and not able to defend themselves, and the Persians took them out. They captured the city. They killed, they regarded Belshazzar as a wicked king, and they killed him on the spot. And at that point, Darius the Mede became the master of Babylon and the most powerful monarch in the world. Now, Daniel bravely declared the truth. He was willing to confront the sins of powerful monarchs, even though it placed him in a dangerous position. Supposedly, Edmund Burke said, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." The righteous must never be silent. We must proclaim the truth and let people know that God is in charge. He still weighs and evaluates nations and will bring judgment on those that are found wanting. Daniel bravely stood up in a culture that was really against him. He was living in a land where people worshipped all kinds of different gods. They did not share the same worldview as Daniel. They didn't have the same values. And he certainly didn't have the religious liberty and freedom that we are blessed with. Now keep that in mind. Too often times Christians are silent about sins in culture and society because we don't want to stir up trouble or make people mad or upset people. We just want everybody to get along. But the Bible tells us that there are times when we must be the prophetic voice in a nation. There are times in our society when we must stand up and proclaim what is right and what is wrong and tell people what God expects. It is up to us to proclaim the truth, otherwise they won't hear it. And we must live it and demonstrate it in our own lives that we might be an example to others. Daniel stands as an example of a man who is willing to stand up for truth and for righteousness in a pagan world. We live in a world that's quickly becoming pagan, at least as far as many are concerned. We need to stand up and proclaim the truth of the gospel even more. We cannot withdraw, we cannot be silent, and we cannot accept the world's values. We have to proclaim the truth no matter what. I was brought to mind of a hymn. It's a more modern hymn. Well, 1984. The modern time period, I guess, is not a new hymn. It's been around for a while. It's a short one, and I like it. And I think it's appropriate when we talk about standing up in the face of adversity to confront sin. In heavenly armor we'll enter the land. The battle belongs to the Lord. No weapon that's fashioned against us will stand. The battle belongs to the Lord. And we sing glory and honor, power and strength to the Lord. We sing glory, honor, power and strength to the Lord. When the power of darkness comes in like a flood, the battle belongs to the Lord. He's raised up a standard, the power of his blood. The battle belongs to the Lord. And we sing glory, honor, power and strength to the Lord. We sing glory, honor, power and strength to the Lord. Thank you for watching. I pray that this lesson has been informative and a blessing. Please share this lesson with others, and if you are able, I would like to invite you to join us at Ebenezer Baptist Church. Ebenezer Baptist Church is located at 7305 Highway 166 in Douglasville, Georgia. Sunday school is at 9:45 a.m. and morning worship is at 11 a.m. We also have an evening worship service on Sundays at 6 p.m. We have a weekly prayer meeting at 7 p.m. on Wednesdays. Additionally, if you have any questions about the lesson or have any prayer requests, please email me at pastorterrybraswell@gmail.com. Thank you.